Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
Growing up, just to kind of give you some background on my life, my father was a college professor. He taught high school, and then when I was 7, he went back and got his PhD and then became a college professor at Michigan Tech University. My stepmom has her PhD. My mother almost got her PhD. She got her master's. A lot of education in my family. It's kind of an education sort of family. And so we would sit around and we would talk about all sorts of different things. My father was a professor of education, so he was going off to conferences and coming back. And we'd sit around the dinner table. I'm sure if your father was a financial advisor, you would talk about financial advising. If your if your parents were, into whatever sales, you'd talk about sales. But we talked about a lot of educational things. And one of the things that my dad was always bringing things home because he was teaching students how to go into high schools and teach science. And one of the things he taught us, or we talked about at home, was lifeboat ethics. And hey, if you're on a lifeboat, who gets to stay and who doesn't? But anyhow, I was looking into it in preparing for the program, and actually the term lifeboat ethics was coined by, I shouldn't say it was coined by this person. I don't know that for a fact. But there was an American ecologist. His name was Garrett Harding. In 1974, he wrote an essay that was titled "Lifeboat Ethics: The Case Against Helping the Poor." And it was as you can imagine, it was a very controversial argument, but it had to do with allocating resources in the world. And his position, not my position, his position was that he suggested that the rich nations were essentially in lifeboats and were already full or overpopulated, and that the poor nations were like people swimming in the water. And if you take in too many people swimming in the water, it will sink your lifeboat. Now, again, very controversial. That's not my position. This is not political, but I just wanted to kind of share about the notion of lifeboat ethics. And people, the detractors from this, they argued that what Hardin postulated really was an oversimplification of the way the world is set up the way it is. I mean, why are poor nations poor and rich nations rich? So anyhow, we don't need to get into that. But lifeboat ethics really kind of morphed into games that were facilitation games. One of the ones we talked about sitting around the table, you're on a lifeboat and these are the people on the lifeboat and only so many people could stay. You've got the smart person, you've got the wealthy person, you've got the person who's got a strong back. And I forget all the different people that were on there, but you just had to make decisions. Whatever it was. And there's not necessarily a right or a wrong answer to these things, but it's, those are decisions. Other lifeboat ethic type games. There was a game called the Trolley Problem, or there is a game called the Trolley Problem. And essentially participants are asked to decide whether to switch the path of a runaway trolley to save the lives of 5 people at the expense of 1. And so there's a moral dilemma there that people need to debate. The Mars Colony game is another lifeboat ethics kind of game. And again, due to limited resources, who gets a trip to Mars and who's got to stay on planet Earth? I think that's a question. It's probably a real question that Elon Musk and others are trying to answer. Is like, well, who do we want to bring to Mars? Looking at planet Earth as kind of a lifeboat. Who do we want to have up there? The Desert Island game, again, limited resources, who gets to stay, who can't stay. And then there's the medical resource allocation game. There's lots of versions of iterations of this, people making decisions. And I think we went through this with the pandemic. You know what? Who gets a ventilator? Who doesn't get a ventilator? We talked about that. Who gets masks? Who don't get masks? These are all very controversial or very dilemma oriented questions. The climate change game, sort of same sort of thing. I remember there was another game we talked about where you're stranded on the moon, and there are certain items. What items do you want to have? Do you want matches? Well, why do you need matches on the moon? Because there's no oxygen, so you would leave the matches behind. You could only bring so many things with you. The notion of lifeboat ethics or those sorts of games are that you have limited resources. There are limited resources, and you just need to make a decision with respect to what are you going to do with those limited resources. So a few years ago, I was thinking about that, thinking about those conversations, and just thinking about networking, and sort of came up with a dilemma game like this. And I have a couple of them. I'll talk about all of them at some point or another. But what's the biggest resource or the most limited resource we have? And it's time. And so the first networking dilemma game I have was called The Best Contact. And so bear with me. I'm going to kind of read this out, and then we'll talk about it. Consider this: as the day was more hectic than you expected and traffic more hairy than usual, you find yourself walking into the business after hours extremely late. At the event, as the event is now winding down, you know that you only have time to establish one meaningful relationship, only one. Although the venue is pretty much cleared out, you find that there are only three people still available, each with whom you're familiar, but none you really know. Person one: the person is not a competitor, but in many ways you're equal. While you each have almost completely different networks, this person's network is comparable in size and diversity. Further, you each have enjoyed a comparable level of personal and professional success. That's person one. Person one is our contemporary, if you will. Person two: this person is more or less a local business legend, heading up a much heralded corporate venture. Not only does this person have a wonderful professional acumen, the person also has an incredible broad network of many envious contacts. The business legend, person number two. Person number three: this person is not only in transition, but also not really sure as at this time as to whether they're headed back into the corporate world or something entrepreneurial. As this person spent years working for the same corporate employer, both the breadth and depth of their network is limited. Given what you know, which one and only one do you attempt to build a relationship with to maximize long-term networking benefits from this event? And why would you choose those? There's the dilemma, right? You have three people and you have a limited number of time. Now, I've posed this question to people. We've done this exercise. We do this exercise from time to time in AmSpirit Business Connections when we have meetings where there's a space there or time for something like this, usually close to the holidays. And it's always very, very interesting. There's always one wisecracker who will say, well, I would talk to all three. I would bring them in together, or they would change the rules to make it fit. But the rules are you can only talk to one person, and that's just the rules. And that's part of the facilitation. So who would you talk to? You know what? There is no right or wrong answer. And when I do this facilitation, I generally get an argument for every answer. And there's really no judgment there. It sort of depends upon who the person who's answering and what's important to them at that particular moment. But the questions I ask in pushing the facilitation along, what are the advantages of establishing a relationship with each person? You have the person who's your contemporary. They're not competing with you, but they're out there and they're as successful and as connected as you are. That's the contemporary. You have the business legend, and then you have the person in transition. What are the advantages of each? The person who's your contemporary, certainly the advantages of your contemporary is building a relationship with them can really open a lot of doors for you of people who are really kind of on the same level. As far as the person who is the business legend, you know, there a ton of a ton of advantages to that in that they have some really high level contacts. They can get you in doors that you didn't even know they were there. And that's the advantage there. And the advantage of the person who is in transition is it really gives you an opportunity to help other people. You can really make a difference in somebody's world. Now, what are the challenges with each person? Now, the challenge with your colleague or your contemporary is, you're gonna, there's much to gain, but there's much to give too, right? I mean, it can't be all take. You can't be all, okay, person who's just like me, give me everything you've got and, nothing in return. You're going to have to devote time and energy to contributing to them as well. And sometimes, depending upon who you are and your situation, that can be time that you don't necessarily have. With respect to the business legend, the challenge with respect to that is, yeah, they know a ton of people, and that's great. And you're just another bucket of sand, on the beach. And so, trying to get on their radar, it's not a given, right, that you're going to get on their radar. And then the challenge with respect to the person who's in transition, they're in transition. They don't really have much of a network, and it's an investment. Who knows? But that's the challenge with it. Um, how would you select the person? It really runs the gamut. It depends upon the individual. I do have people who say, you know what, I would go right after the business legend. I get it. It can be tough, but I'm going to swing for the fences. And if it doesn't work out, at least I tried. I would kick myself if I was in the room with, I don't know, Elon Musk or whoever else. Think of who your local business legend might be, and I didn't at least try. But then I've had other people who will say, I would approach the person who is in transition. I really want to make a difference in somebody's world, and I know if I make a difference in somebody's world, that they'll really remember me, and that will bear fruit down the line. And if the rules are which will provide the best long-term benefit, then that person in transition really holds the most potential. And then other people will say, well, I really want to connect with that contemporary because it's, we can share a lot of information. We can help each other with respect to insights. We're both kind of on that same plane, and they're going to be as interested in what I can do for them as I'm interested in what they can do for me. And there's going to be a lot of give and take going back and forth. Um, and so I end up getting all those answers when I do this particular exercise. What's the right answer? There is no right answer. It's a dilemma, and you only get to choose one. But it gets people to think a little bit about what they're doing when they're going to networking events. Um, you know, I know the title of this is at an event. Who should you connect with? You know what? I don't know. It really depends upon where you're at and what you're trying to accomplish. But more or less, when you're going to networking events, you're running into these sorts of people. And there's probably just not limited to those three people. But when you go to a networking event, I'll subscribe to the notion that Berta Medina, a life coach out there, she shared with me, she'll tell me, or she says in her book, she tells everybody, listen, when I go to a networking event and there's 5 people, it's my objective to get 5 business cards. Meaning I want to get a business card from each one of those 5 people. But when she goes to an event with 100 people, it's her objective to get 5 business cards, right? Because she knows that a business event may only be 2 hours, 1 hour. It's not very long, and she's not going to get an opportunity to meet all 100 people. So don't. So she has to make the decision. All right, I'm going to limit it to 5. Who are those 5 people? And there are a lot of people who will say, well, you know what? I'm not really concerned about who the people are. I just meet people. Everybody is connected, and that's very true. That's very, very true. But it's certainly something to think about as you're at the event, and people have different strategies there's just a limited amount of time you have in a networking event, or really networking in general. You have a limited amount of time every day making decisions with respect to who are you going to schedule a Zoom call with, who are you going to have a cup of coffee with. These are all questions that we face day in and day out, and it's something that we need to try and answer for ourselves. So think about this as you're heading to the next networking event. It's easy for me to say, or just doing any networking in general. Is this making sense for me? Is this fitting with my overall objective going forward?
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AmSpirit.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connection. All rights reserved.